A rich and spoiled young man cruelly decides to bury his horse in an abandoned desert under the scorching sun. Dehydrated and suffering from unbearable heat, the horse seems unable to resist any longer until something surprising happens, something that will change everything. If you love animals as much as we do, subscribe to our channel now so you don't miss any heartwarming stories. Thanks. Now, let's get back to our story. The golden dust from the racetrack still hung in the air as Andrew Montgomery slammed his fist against the wall of his private stable. The echo of the impact startled the horses in the nearby stalls, but he didn't care about the animals' discomfort. His eyes, normally as cold as the water in an empty swimming pool, now burned with a fury that made the stable hands cower in the shadows. The 24-year-old heir to the oil fortune had just watched his pride and joy, Lightning Bolt, stumble in the final stretch of one of the most important races on the circuit. "Incompetent! Worthless animal!" Andrew bellowed, pacing back and forth. The impeccably tailored Italian suit, now rumpled from stress, clashed with the rage contorting his face. His perfectly styled hair began to fall out of place, and beads of sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the dirt from the racetrack. In the far corner of the stable, Bob, the oldest groom, watched the scene with a heavy heart. Having cared for racehorses for 30 years, he had never witnessed such a display of cruelty. His experienced eyes had noticed weeks ago that something wasn't right with Lightning Bolt. The magnificent animal was subtly limping after workouts, but when he tried to raise the issue, he was brutally silenced by management. "Mr. Montgomery," a trembling voice came from the stable entrance. It was Peterson, the ranch manager, a man who had learned to bend over backwards as easily as others breathe. "The bets. The loss was considerable, but we can recover next season. Lightning Bolt is still one of the best." "Shut your mouth!" Andrew spun on his heels, approaching the manager menacingly. "Do you know how much I lost today? Do you know how many zeros were on the check I had to sign? And all because of this. His words were cut off by a hysterical laugh that echoed through the stable. Outside, the sun began to set, painting the sky with orange hues that usually brought peace to the end of a race day. But there was no peace in Andrew Montgomery's eyes. There was only a cruel decision forming in his failure-stricken mind. Lightning Bolt, still panting from the race, was being washed down by one of the younger grooms. Sweat streamed down his glossy black coat, and his eyes, normally lively, seemed clouded by the pain he tried to hide. The horse was a true champion, with over 15 wins under his belt, valued at millions. But at that moment, to his owner, he was worth no more than the dirt beneath his hooves. Andrew approached the animal, his steps echoing on the stable boards. The employees present held their breath, feeling the tension in the air. The young millionaire stopped before Lightning Bolt, his eyes locked on the animal's. For a moment, it seemed he would stroke the horse's muzzle, as he had done so many times after victories. Instead, his words cut through the air like knives. "Take this loser out to the desert," he ordered, his voice laced with calculated coldness. "Bury him in the sand. Leave only his head sticking out." A sepulchral silence fell over the stable. "Let him die slowly, as he deserves." The sun finally set on the horizon, and with it, the last chance of salvation for Lightning Bolt seemed to have been extinguished. No one dared to contest the order. The fear of unemployment, of debt, of hunger, spoke louder than compassion. One by one, the employees lowered their eyes, feeling the weight of forced complicity on their shoulders. Andrew adjusted his tie, regaining his composure. "Peterson, make sure it's done today, and far enough away so that no one finds him." With these words, he spun on his heels and left the stable, leaving behind not only a condemned horse, but also the last shred of humanity that might still exist in his heart. In the small town of Harmony Creek, less than 20 miles from the Montgomerys' luxurious ranch, the rising sun found Michael already awake, his worried brown eyes fixed on the window of his modest room. His dog, Lucky, had run away the night before, probably chasing some wild animal. The 12-year-old boy had barely slept, thinking about his best friend lost in the desert. "Michael, breakfast is on the table." His mother, Mrs. Davis's voice echoed through the simple house. The aroma of fresh coffee and homemade bread would normally draw him in immediately, but that morning, his only concern was finding Lucky. In the kitchen, he found his parents. John, his father, had that distant look he'd carried since they lost their jobs at the ranch. For 15 years, he and Clara had been the best horse groomers in the region, until young Andrew Montgomery decided to modernize operations, replacing experienced employees with machines and cheaper labor. "Son, at least drink a glass of milk before you go," Mrs. Davis insisted, knowing the boy's determination well. Her hair, prematurely gray from the stress of the last few years, framed a still young face marked by worry. John looked up from the old newspaper he was rereading for the third time. "Be careful, son. Take enough water and don't go too far. If you don't find Lucky by noon, come home." Michael began his journey as soon as the sun rose on the horizon. The desert was a treacherous place, but he knew the region well. Since he was a child, he had accompanied his parents in their work with the horses, and even after the dismissal, he continued to explore the area, dreaming of the day he would also be a respected groom. After 2 hours of walking, Michael began to notice something strange in the landscape. Recent tire tracks cut through the sand, heading towards a more isolated area of the desert. Intrigued, he decided to follow the tracks. His heart beat faster with each step, driven both by the hope of finding Lucky and the curiosity about what could have brought vehicles to that remote region during the night. That's when he heard it, a low sound, almost a whimper mixed with the wind blowing between the dunes. Michael stopped, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. It wasn't Lucky's bark, but something different, something that made his skin crawl. He cautiously climbed a small sand dune, and upon reaching the top, his heart nearly stopped. There, partially buried in the sand, was one of the most beautiful horses he had ever seen in his life. The black coat, even covered in sand and sweat, still maintained a majestic sheen. The head raised in despair was the only visible part of the animal's body. Michael immediately recognized that horse. It was impossible not to recognize Lightning Bolt, the champion he had watched so many times from the fence of the Montgomery Ranch, dreaming of one day being able to ride such a magnificent animal. Michael approached slowly, speaking in a low, soothing voice, as he had learned from his parents. "Easy, champ, easy. I'm here to help." He took the water bottle from his pocket and carefully brought it to the animal's parched muzzle. Lightning Bolt drank eagerly, as if he hadn't seen water in hours. "Who did this to you?" Michael murmured, tears starting to form in his eyes. The search for Lucky was temporarily forgotten in the face of the much greater emergency before him. "Hang in there, champ. I'll get help. I promise I'll be right back." Michael ran as he had never run in his life. His lungs burned and his legs protested, but the image of the magnificent horse buried alive would not allow him to slow down. The sun was already high in the sky when he spotted the first houses of Harmony Creek, and his heart beat so hard it felt like it wanted to jump out of his chest. "Help!" he shouted as soon as he reached the town square, where some residents were enjoying the shade of the old trees. "We need to help. There's a horse buried in the desert." "It's Lightning Bolt," he exclaimed, trying to catch his breath. "Mr. Montgomery's horse. Someone buried him in the desert, only his head is sticking out. He's going to die if we don't do something." "It's true, I swear." Michael felt tears of frustration starting to form. Why didn't anyone believe him? "Please, we need to go now. He's dehydrated, suffering in the sun." The boy's face lit up at finally finding someone who took him seriously. "Yes, Mom, I know exactly where he is." Gradually, other residents began to mobilize. Joe, the blacksmith, brought his sturdiest shovels. Old Mrs. Jenkins filled jugs of water. Carl, the pharmacist's son, grabbed a first aid kit. In less than half an hour, a small caravan was ready to depart. "There was no time, Mom. Every minute counts." Michael gently disengaged from the hug. "Dad, you need to come along. You understand horses better than anyone here." Ms. Evans quickly organized the expedition. "Mr. Peterson will go ahead with Michael showing the way. John and Joe will go along for the immediate rescue. The rest of us will follow in my car and Carl's van." "Absolutely, Miss Evans. I'd recognize him anywhere, and there's more." Michael lowered his voice. "I saw recent tire tracks. Someone took him out there on purpose last night." The vehicles departed in convoy, kicking up dust on the dirt road. The sun was already close to noon, and time was running against them. In the back seat of the pickup truck, Michael could barely sit still from so much anxiety. He had promised Lightning Bolt that he would return, and he was keeping his word. Now he just needed to pray that it wasn't too late. "Hang in there, you two," he whispered, thinking of both the horse and Lucky, still lost somewhere in the desert. Fate had placed 2 lives in his young hands, and he didn't intend to fail either of them. The sun was at its peak when the caravan reached the location where Lightning Bolt was buried. The magnificent animal had managed to keep his head up, but his eyes, once so lively, now showed a deep weariness. Upon seeing Michael returning with help, the horse whinnied weakly, as if gathering his last strength to thank him. "Good heavens!" exclaimed John, jumping out of the pickup truck before it had even come to a complete stop. His years of experience with horses had not prepared him for such a cruel scene. "We need to act fast, but very carefully. One wrong move, and we could hurt him even more." Ms. Evans immediately began filming with her cell phone, documenting the shocking scene. "This is clear evidence of animal cruelty," she murmured, while capturing images of the tire tracks and the condition of the horse. John examined the situation with experienced eyes. The sand had been compacted around the animal's body, making excavation a delicate challenge. "We need to create a gentle ramp. Dig in a circle, keeping a safe distance from his body. Michael's son, stay near Lightning Bolt's head. He trusts you." The boy didn't need to be told twice. He approached the horse with the water bottle, offering small sips while whispering words of comfort. "It's okay, champ. We've come to save you. You're strong. You can do it." "There's something wrong with his hind leg," John observed, noticing a subtle swelling as the sand was removed. "Looks like an old injury, poorly healed." It was when they were almost freeing the front legs that they heard a familiar bark. "Lucky!" Michael shouted, his heart leaping as he saw his dog running towards the group. The mixed breed seemed tired and dirty, but he was safe and sound. Michael hugged his furry friend with tears in his eyes, realizing that fate had intertwined the 2 searches in a mysterious way. Lucky, after receiving water and affection, stood next to Lightning Bolt, as if he wanted to help with the rescue. With over 2 hours of hard work, they finally managed to create a safe path for the horse to get out. John, strategically positioned, coordinated the final efforts. Now comes the most delicate part. He's weak and scared. We need to provide support while he tries to get up. Ropes were positioned to help stabilize the animal, while everyone prepared for the crucial moment. Michael remained in front, maintaining eye contact with Lightning Bolt. "Come on, champ, you can do it. We're all here with you." Ms. Evans, who hadn't stopped filming, captured the exact moment when Lightning Bolt, even exhausted and injured, raised his head with dignity, as if to show that his nobility could not be buried. "This is going to show the world what happened here," she said, her hands trembling with emotion as she held the cell phone. With Lightning Bolt finally standing, John's first concern was to better examine the injury on the animal's hind leg. Years of experience with horses had given him a clinical eye for problems of this kind. Kneeling carefully, he ran his calloused hands over the swollen area, feeling every irregularity. Ms. Evans approached with the cell phone, filming the improvised examination. "What do you mean, John? Are you saying someone knew about this injury?" Mrs. Davis, who was helping to clean the animal's coat with damp towels, felt a pang in her heart. That's why he stumbled in yesterday's race. It wasn't his fault, poor thing. He was suffering the whole time. "Exactly, son," John confirmed, getting up with difficulty. "And I bet I know who gave the order for that. The same one who probably ordered this barbarity to be done to the animal." "Dr. Ramirez," he replied promptly, "a professional who was always correct until he began to give in to the pressures of young Mr. Montgomery. The last time I saw him, he seemed tormented, as if he was carrying a huge weight on his conscience." "What are we going to do now?" asked old Mrs. Jenkins, distributing water and bread among the rescuers. "We can't just take a horse of this value to town. They'll come after him." Michael, who was playing distractedly with the ID on Lightning Bolt's neck, caught everyone's attention. "There's something engraved back here. It looks like a phone number." The group fell silent as John dialed. After 3 rings, a tired voice answered. John put it on speakerphone. Another silence, followed by a deep sigh. "I can't bear to carry this on my conscience anymore, John. Andrew, he forced me to hide Lightning Bolt's injury. He threatened to destroy my career if I didn't cooperate. I have all the evidence saved. Exams, true reports, even recordings of the threats." The afternoon wore on as the first patrol cars from the environmental police arrived at the rescue site. Ms. Evans had alerted the authorities as soon as the videos started going viral on social media. Dr. Ramirez was also on his way, bringing with him a folder full of documents that would prove his accusations against Andrew Montgomery. "The specialized veterinary team is already coming," informed Sergeant Miller after examining the situation. "But we need to document everything before moving the animal. This is a case of serious environmental crime." "You were very brave today, son," said Mrs. Davis, hugging the boy by the shoulders. "Your father and I are very proud." Before Mrs. Davis could answer, a cloud of dust on the horizon announced the arrival of more vehicles. The first to stop was a luxurious car from which stepped a middle-aged man wearing an impeccably white lab coat, Dr. Ramirez. Right behind, a van equipped with veterinary instruments and a team specializing in the rescue of large animals. The vet walked directly to Lightning Bolt, his eyes watering as he saw the animal's condition. "Forgive me, champ," he whispered, gently stroking the horse's neck. "I should have done something sooner." Dr. Ramirez nodded, taking a series of documents from the folder. "Here's everything. The original exams showing the injury, the reports I was forced to falsify, and this." He took out a small recorder. "All the conversations with Andrew, where he threatens me and admits knowing about the problem." "Andrew discovered the injury 3 weeks before the race," explained Dr. Ramirez. "But he had made very high bets. He forced me to medicate Lightning Bolt with absurd doses of anti-inflammatories. When I tried to refuse, he threatened to destroy my reputation, said his family had the power to prevent me from working anywhere in the country." The veterinary team began to examine Lightning Bolt, preparing him for transport. A young veterinarian, Dr. Carter, confirmed John's initial diagnosis. "This injury is serious and old. It's a miracle he was able to run like this." "They're coming," murmured Ms. Evans, her journalistic instinct on alert. "The story leaked faster than we expected." At that moment, the Montgomery Enterprises helicopter landed a safe distance away, kicking up a cloud of sand. 3 men descended: Andrew Montgomery, his father Richard Montgomery, and a lawyer with a severe appearance. "Get those cameras out of here," shouted Andrew, advancing towards the group. "This horse is my property. You are committing a crime." "Get that filthy mutt away," Andrew bellowed, recoiling instinctively. Richard Montgomery, who until then had watched the scene with apparent indifference, frowned at hearing the accusation coming from a child. His gaze swept the area, registering every detail: the marks in the sand, the press cameras, the police officers, the veterinarian with his folder of documents. Sergeant Miller seized the moment to approach, his impeccable uniform emanating authority. "Mr. Montgomery, we have substantial evidence of animal cruelty, falsification of veterinary documents, and obstruction of justice. Your son will be taken to the station for questioning." "What you have," interrupted Ms. Evans, her cell phone still recording everything, "is a national scandal unfolding live. Your court orders won't stifle the videos that are already circulating throughout the country." The vet, trembling but determined, raised his recorder. "I have everything recorded, Mr. Montgomery. Every threat, every order to illegally medicate the horse, every... Like you destroyed ours." John's voice sounded strong and clear. "Like you destroyed the lives of dozens of families when you automated the ranch. Now we know the result. Mistreated animals, falsified documents, lives at risk." "Excuse me?" Ms. Evans stepped forward, incredulous. A deep silence fell over the desert. The sun, now almost disappearing on the horizon, painted the sky an intense red, as if nature itself reflected the drama of the moment. Night began to fall over the desert as the police cars departed, taking Andrew Montgomery to the station for questioning. The young millionaire had been handcuffed after trying to assault Dr. Ramirez, turning an already delicate situation into an even more dramatic spectacle for the press cameras. Richard Montgomery remained at the scene, his imposing figure now slightly bent by the weight of events. His eyes didn't leave Lightning Bolt, who was receiving the first treatments from the specialized veterinary team. The businessman nodded mechanically, signing the documents without question. For the first time in his life, the man who had built an empire seemed lost, as if all his power and influence had turned into sand slipping through his fingers. "Let him stay, Mrs. Davis," John interjected, placing his hand on his wife's shoulder. "Our son showed today that sometimes children see the truth more clearly than adults." "Mr. Montgomery," she called, approaching the businessman with her cell phone in hand, "I'm receiving information that Lightning Bolt wasn't the first. There are records of other horses that have mysteriously disappeared from the ranch in recent years." Richard Montgomery closed his eyes for a moment, as if each word were a stab. When he reopened them, his gaze had changed. "I knew," he admitted in a hoarse voice. "I always knew Andrew had problems, but I preferred to ignore it, cover it up with money, protect the family's reputation." Dr. Ramirez, who was organizing his documents to hand over to the authorities, raised his head sharply. "Hurricane," he murmured, referring to another famous horse that had disappeared 2 years before, "and Stormy last year." "No," Richard Montgomery replied quickly. "Andrew secretly sold them to other countries after hurting them in the stalls. When a horse disappointed him, he..." The businessman couldn't continue. "Can I go along?" asked Michael, his pleading eyes alternating between his parents and the veterinarian. "Young Michael," continued the businessman, "you and your parents showed today something that I've tried to teach my son throughout his life, without success: character. I'd like to offer you not money, but an opportunity, a chance to transform this tragedy into something positive." John and Mrs. Davis approached their son protectively while Ms. Evans continued filming. Richard Montgomery looked at each of them before continuing his proposal that would forever change the destiny of all those involved. "I want to turn the ranch into a sanctuary for rescued horses," he announced, surprising everyone. a place where animals that have suffered abuse can recover and live in peace. And I want your family, John, to take over the management of the place. Because I've spent decades building an empire, but I failed at the only thing that really mattered, raising a son with compassion, replied Richard, his voice laden with regret. Today, I saw more humanity in a 12-year-old boy than I managed to teach my own son in 24 years. Yes, Michael, and I want you and your parents to help me with that. John and Mrs. Davis have the technical knowledge and, more importantly, the heart needed to make this work. And you, he smiled slightly, you have something that you can't learn in any university, genuine love for these animals. The businessman's face hardened for a moment. Andrew needs to learn that there are consequences for his actions. He will face justice and afterwards will undergo a long period of therapy. The family's money won't get him out of this one. John and Mrs. Davis exchanged a meaningful look before nodding. Go with him, son, said John. Your mother and I need to talk more with Mr. Montgomery about this proposal. I want to do this right, he explained. We're going to create a legally constituted foundation. You'll have total autonomy to manage the sanctuary, with resources guaranteed by a permanent fund. We can rehire the former employees, create rehabilitation programs for traumatized horses, even develop social projects with the local schools. Unfortunately, we won't have any difficulty with that, replied Richard, his face shadowed by sadness. I've already discovered that Andrew kept detailed records of all the horses he harmed. We'll track them down, buy them back if necessary. And there's more. I've received information that there are other horses at risk in various ranches across the country. People who, like me, turned a blind eye for too long. Ms. Evans made a note on her phone. This could turn into a national network for the protection of race horses. John, who had been silent for a few minutes, finally spoke. We'll need guarantees, well-drafted contracts, clear documentation. We can't risk the future of the families who depend on this work. At the specialized veterinary clinic, Lightning Bolt received the intensive care needed for his recovery. Michael had spent the entire night by the horse's side, sleeping in an improvised chair, while Lucky kept watch faithfully at his feet. Dr. Carter watched in admiration the boy's dedication, who only agreed to leave the animal when the medical procedures were really necessary. The detailed exams revealed the extent of the damage, explained the veterinarian to John and Mrs. Davis, who had arrived early that morning. The old injury on his hind leg is serious, but treatable. With proper physiotherapy and time, he can recover. However, Michael, who was listening to the conversation pretending to be distracted with Lucky, felt a pang in his heart. He approached the horse, who was now resting more peacefully thanks to the medication. It doesn't matter, champ. You don't need to prove anything to anyone anymore. At that same moment, on the other side of town, Richard Montgomery faced a tense meeting with his legal team. The news about Andrew had dominated all the news reports, and the investigations revealed a disturbing pattern of behavior that had extended for years. The documents for the creation of the foundation are ready, informed Dr. Miller, the new lawyer specializing in environmental causes. The initial fund will be more than enough to guarantee the operation of the sanctuary for decades. Now we need to focus on the most delicate part, the transition of management. Richard nodded, watching through his office window the city that stretched below. I want everything to be done with total transparency. No shady deals or legal maneuvers this time. I've had enough of that for a lifetime. In the town of Harmony Creek, the news of the transformation of the ranch into a sanctuary had spread like wildfire. Former employees began to gather in the town square, discussing the possibilities of returning to the work they loved. Ms. Evans, who couldn't stop receiving calls from major media outlets, organized the information for a series of special reports. It's not just about saving horses, she explained to her sources. It's about re-democratizing access to dignified work, about recognizing the value of traditional knowledge in the treatment of animals, about transforming a story of cruelty into one of hope. Back at the clinic, Dr. Carter presented John and Mrs. Davis with a detailed rehabilitation plan for Lightning Bolt. We'll start with hydrotherapy as soon as the inflammation subsides. Then, we'll introduce controlled exercises. The clinic's therapeutic pool will be fundamental in this process. If everything goes well, in 3 weeks he can be moved, as long as he maintains the treatment on site. That's why it's so important that the sanctuary has an adequate rehabilitation structure. John smiled, proud of his son's suggestion. That's an excellent idea, Michael. I'll propose that to Mr. Montgomery when we discuss the renovations. 3 weeks passed quickly, filled with an intense activity of transformation. The old Montgomery Ranch, once a symbol of prestige and competition, was now being reformulated to become a sanctuary of hope. The old racing stalls were adapted to offer more space and comfort, while the tracks received a new treatment to serve as recovery areas. Michael visited Lightning Bolt every day at the clinic, following every small progress in his recovery. The horse responded surprisingly well to the treatment, especially during the hydrotherapy sessions, where he demonstrated a willpower that moved even the most experienced veterinarians. "It's amazing how much he trusts you," commented Dr. Carter, watching Michael gently guide Lightning Bolt in the therapeutic pool. Usually, horses that have experienced trauma take much longer to reconnect with humans. At the ranch, now renamed New Horizons Sanctuary, John coordinated the renovations with the same dedication he had once dedicated to racehorses. Former employees returned, bringing with them not only experience, but also a new sense of purpose. "Take a look at this," he showed a group of grooms, pointing to the project spread out on an improvised table. "Each area will be adapted for a specific type of rehabilitation. Here we'll have the physiotherapy zone, there the pastures for free exercise, and in this part," he smiled, pointing to a detailed drawing, "the hydrotherapy center that Mr. Montgomery approved to build." Mrs. Davis, for her part, had taken on the responsibility of organizing the records and documentation of the horses that were beginning to be identified for rescue. On her desk, a pile of folders grew each day, each telling a story of suffering that now had the chance of a happy ending. "I just received confirmation," she announced, entering the meeting room where John was discussing the projects. "Hurricane arrives next week from Uruguay, and there's more. We found Stormy at a ranch in Paraguay." Ms. Evans, who had become a constant presence at the sanctuary, documenting every stage of the transformation, raised her eyes from her laptop. "This is going to make an incredible story. The International Racehorse Rescue Network, how an act of cruelty inspired a revolution in animal treatment." Richard Montgomery, who visited the site weekly to monitor the progress of the changes, seemed like a different person. The ruthless businessman had given way to a more reflective man, genuinely interested in the well-being of the animals and the people involved in the project. "I've received 3 more requests from other ranch owners," he commented during one of the visits. "They want to donate horses that can no longer compete. It seems our initiative is provoking a change of mindset in the industry." "It's hard to believe that in just 3 weeks so much has changed," reflected Michael, sitting on the grass next to Lightning Bolt during a break in treatment. Lucky, who had become a kind of unofficial mascot of the clinic, rested nearby, always attentive to his equine friend. The day of Lightning Bolt's transport to New Horizons Sanctuary dawned with a special energy in the air. A small crowd was already gathering at the gates of the old ranch, now completely renovated. Welcome banners decorated the entrance, and cameras from various media outlets recorded the historic moment. Michael had barely slept the night before, anxious about his friend's arrival. He had spent hours helping prepare the special space destined for Lightning Bolt, a spacious area with direct access to the pastures and close to the new hydrotherapy center. John supervised the last details when the sound of engines announced the arrival of the convoy. The veterinary van came in front, followed by two support cars. Dr. Ramirez and Dr. Carter had insisted on personally accompanying the transport, ensuring that everything went without a hitch. The moment the van doors were opened was recorded by dozens of cameras. Lightning Bolt emerged majestic, his black coat shining under the morning sun. 3 weeks of intensive treatment had worked wonders. Although he still limped slightly, his eyes had recovered their vibrant shine, and his posture had returned to be haughty. Lightning Bolt, however, seemed to have other plans. As soon as his hooves touched the familiar soil of the ranch, he raised his head and whinnied, as if greeting his return. The sound echoed through the site, causing shivers in all those present. Richard Montgomery, who watched everything from a discreet distance, couldn't contain his emotion upon seeing the transformation of the place that for so long had been the scene of so much ambition and cruelty. The old plaques of records and victories had given way to messages about compassion and respect for animals. When they arrived at the area prepared for Lightning Bolt, a surprise awaited. Bob, the old groom who had tried to warn about the horse's injury, was there with tears in his eyes. "Forgive me for not doing more to protect you," murmured Bob, his voice choked. "But now you're home, really home." Ms. Evans, who didn't stop photographing and taking notes, approached Richard Montgomery. "You transformed a tragedy into hope. This will inspire a lot of people." At that moment, as if to crown the occasion, Lightning Bolt did something that surprised everyone. He took his first steps completely alone towards the green pasture that awaited him. His slight limp didn't diminish in any way the dignity of his movements. On that special morning, the sanctuary was preparing for an important event, the arrival of the 20th rescued horse, coinciding with Michael's graduation from the first equine treatment course for young apprentices, a program created especially by John and Mrs. Davis to train a new generation of caregivers. "I can't believe I did it," Michael smiled, adjusting the certificate in his trembling hands. Beside him, Lightning Bolt, now completely recovered, grazed peacefully. Lucky, as always, kept his faithful guard close to the two. "Your work with Lightning Bolt has become a national reference," commented Ms. Evans, who was finalizing a series of reports on the project. "Other ranches are changing their practices after we showed how it's possible to care for horses in a more humane way." The most recent news was about Andrew Montgomery. After months of intensive therapy and volunteer work in animal shelters, he was beginning to show signs of genuine remorse. His father, Richard, remained firm in his decision to prioritize his son's recovery before any return to business. The answer came from Michael himself, who now participated in important meetings as a representative of the young apprentices. "If he's really changing, he deserves a chance. That's what we gave the horses, wasn't it?" That afternoon, the sanctuary received its newest resident, Stormy, finally rescued from Paraguay. The horse, once a champion like Lightning Bolt, arrived scared and distrustful. To everyone's surprise, it was Lightning Bolt who first approached the new companion, as if he perfectly understood what the other had gone through. "It's amazing how they communicate," observed Dr. Carter, who now coordinated a permanent team of veterinarians at the sanctuary. "Lightning Bolt has become a kind of ambassador for the new horses. He helps them adapt, shows that it's possible to trust again." The success of New Horizons Sanctuary inspired the creation of a national network for the protection of racehorses. Other entrepreneurs in the sector, impressed with the results, began to allocate resources to similar projects in their regions. John hugged his wife, watching proudly as his son Michael conducted a practical class for other young apprentices. It wasn't just Lightning Bolt who transformed. We've all changed. We learned that sometimes you have to lose everything to find a greater purpose. The sun began to set on the horizon, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. In the main pasture, Lightning Bolt and Stormy grazed side by side, their manes swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Michael, sitting on the fence with Lucky beside him, watched the scene with a serene smile. The day of Andrew Montgomery's first visit to New Horizons Sanctuary dawned clear and serene. Michael was nervous, but determined to participate in this crucial moment. Beside him, as always, Lightning Bolt maintained a calm and strong presence, as if he understood the importance of that meeting. Andrew arrived accompanied only by his father and his therapist, Dr. Bennett. There was no longer the elegant suit nor the arrogant posture. Dressed simply, with deep, dark circles under his eyes and a different look, he seemed older and, at the same time, younger, as if the weight of arrogance had been replaced by something lighter, albeit painful. The boy shook his head. "No, Dad, I need to be present for Lightning Bolt." It was Michael who broke the ice. "You can start by getting to know the real Lightning Bolt, not the racehorse you wanted him to be, but who he really is." "He's different," murmured Andrew, observing the animal's shiny coat and lively eyes. "He seems happy." "Forgive me," he whispered, not only to the horse, but to everyone present. "I was so lost, so obsessed with proving my worth through victories, that I turned into the worst kind of loser." Michael took advantage of the moment to show Andrew the changes in the sanctuary, the new recovery spaces, the therapeutic pastures, and mainly the other rescued horses who had found a new chance there. Andrew stopped, looking at the boy with a mixture of admiration and shame. "How do you do it? How can you be so wise having only 12 years? The sun began to set when Andrew finally prepared to leave. Before leaving, he turned one last time to Michael. "You saved more than Lightning Bolt's life that day in the desert. You saved mine too, even without knowing it." "Did you see that, champ?" he whispered to Lightning Bolt. "Sometimes those who seem the most lost are the ones who need love the most to find their way back."